In our study tonight, we're going to highlight some of the things that Peter's writing about. First and Second Peter, the only writings we have from Peter. One of the apostles who was the closest to Jesus, and one of the ones who was probably the most notorious of the apostles as far as his up and down relationship with the Lord. And so when we read what he writes, we're reading 1 Peter, and for the purpose of our study, we're inclined to look at 1 Peter as writings to Christians who have been separated from other Christians, other more experienced Christians. And many of these are new Christians, and he's giving them some very basic instructions about things. And that was kind of seen in verse 2, where he talks to them to be like newborn babes. We're going to go down now to verse 9. And we'll read verse 9 and 10. Paul's going to tell them about their new citizenship. He said, "You are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy." It's so very important to let them know who they are. One time there was a young man that went to pick up a girl on a date. Her dad was there to oversee him picking her up to make sure things got started off on the right foot. And right before the daughter left, the father would say, "Dear, remember whose daughter you are." And he would do that at each date. Finally, the young man thought, there's got to be something a little bit more to this than I'm picking up on. So he asked the young lady, he said, "When your father tells you every night when we go out on a date, remember whose daughter you are, what does he really mean by that?" And she said, "He wants me to remember that I am God's child, and therefore I should behave accordingly." Sometimes we need a little reminder of who we are. Not necessarily because we want to keep from being bad, but because we want to realize what a great privilege you and I have as Christians. These people are a chosen people. Y'all ever play games in the playground where you had teams and you picked teams?
Yes.
Okay. Let's see who's listening. We had those games. We had dodgeball. Some reason that's the only one I would get picked early on, was dodgeball. They had a hard time hitting me, especially if I turned sideways. But other games, I wasn't always picked first. I was usually, it's me and some other scrawny-looking, awkward kid, and they would flip a coin. Whoever lost got me. But at any rate, it's nice to be chosen, though. For somebody to say, "I want you," and to choose you early on. And that's what happens to these people. God has chosen them. Handpicked them. I wonder what the apostles felt like when they reflected on this. Peter among those chosen by Jesus. What was Peter?
Fisherman.
A fisherman. You could smell Peter a mile off.
Probably
A fisherman, yeah.
Probably not what you would consider educated.
They
knew how to read and write, maybe.
Yeah. In Acts 4, the Jewish leaders regard them as uneducated men. Peter and John, both of them fishermen. So to be chosen, Peter knows how special that is. And he says, more than that, you're a royal priesthood. The priests wore these fancy garments. The priests got to tell people how they're supposed to live. Yes. Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, he's no doubt writing to both Jews and Gentiles who are members of the church. And it would be something special for the Gentiles to know that they're God's chosen people, not just the Jews, but they're now chosen also, and that they're part of the priesthood. Because only the Jews could say, well, we're God's chosen people, and only some of us got to be priests. But now Peter's saying, no, you're all chosen, and you're all priests.
Yes.
Royal priests, not just one who was a Levite, but one that could go into the Holy of Holies, so to speak.
Yes. And and he kind of emphasized that by saying a people belonging to God, once not a people, but now the people of God. These people have come together as a new kind of a group. Royal priesthood, that's different from just a regular priesthood too. Who else was a royal priest? Remember someone in the Old Testament? Melchizedek, king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. So they have that double privilege there of royalty as well as priesthood, a holy nation. A holy nation. The proverb writer said, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. And every nation that has claimed God as Lord has been blessed by God, and those who have denied God have all fallen. Jeff?
Just curious, in my translation, in verse 9, it has it in a bold type. All verse 9.
Is bold type what?
It's in bold type, a chosen race, royal priesthood, holy nation, people, God's own possession, which is like where he earlier he quoted some scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone. That's also in bold type in this translation. I wondered if that was a reference to something. It doesn't have a reference in the Old Testament. Show it almost is.
I know of no.
Something that they're familiar with. That was something.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not familiar with any Old Testament passages that this relates to.
But it's just different.
Mm-hmm.
As when it gets to verse 9, when it says that, then it's in bold type.
Mine does give reference to
Which translation?
New American Standard.
New American Standard.
My phone gives reference to the chosen nation to Isaiah 43 verse 20 through 23, and the last part of 20, he says, I'll give drink to my chosen people, the people whom I formed for myself, that they might declare my praise.
There are probably some passages that this does refer to, and that would be good to know. The New American Standard is good about putting those in heavier print, Now, if you have an italicized, that means something else. But at any rate, those may be references to the Old Testament. John?
Just had a question about the choosing. You said they were chosen race.
Yes.
When I look at the choosing of the apostles is a different deal. The Calvinists look at it as though you're chosen or you're not chosen. So you really don't have anything to do with whether you are among the same or not. But he says here it's a chosen race. So you can join that race if you want to. You can be among the chosen.
Mhm.
But even the chosen apostles, even Judas fell away, so they weren't guaranteed salvation just because Christ chose them.
Mm-hmm. The word for race, the King James, I believe, has generation, a chosen generation. And the word used there can refer to a generation of people. You just happen to come along in a great generation. We talk about the greatest generation, those who were the soldiers in World War II. But also, that word very oftentimes does relate to race, which would denote a certain particular description of people. We have different racial identifying marks, don't we? Skin color is only one racial identifier. The shape of the eyes is another race identifier. Very, very, very easy to see. Did you know that earlobes is another race identifier? You notice how some people have earlobes, the little hanging down thing, but some people don't. Their ear just goes right into the side of their neck. That's a different race, technically. We don't usually talk about that. Now y'all are looking around. Okay. Did we have an interracial marriage in our family and did not know it?
Foreigners.
It's not obvious, so we don't really pay attention to that one, but it's a special group of people. Yes.
What about of course, the Jews were a chosen race,
Yes.
and that still holds today. But some Jews were lost, and the dead branches are cut off, and the new branches are grafted in. So we're all part of the Jewish race.
Yes. And if you really want to get into a look at that, Romans 11 is an intriguing study of that particular aspect of the Jewish race itself. So these are very special people. Now in verses 11 and 12, he tells them, first of all he says, here's where your citizenship is, and then verses 11 and 12, here's where your citizenship is not. Dear friends, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from sinful desires which war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. You're citizens in one place, which makes you an alien somewhere else. If you go to Japan, you are an alien, legal or illegal. If you and I go to Canada, if we go to any other country, we are aliens technically. And as aliens, we will behave a little differently. Peter's telling them that as aliens, he wants them to abstain from the world itself. This is not, we sing a song, this world is not my home, I'm just a passing through. Our goal is not to lay up treasures here, but in heaven. So knowing where we don't really belong, Peter tells them, here's what you need to do. Abstain from sinful desires. I read a story earlier today about somebody who'd gone to school because they were discussing sex education of the children. And one guy raised his hand and said, well, what about teaching abstinence in this program? And immediately everyone in the room laughed at him and, just mocked him. And the instructor just kind of shook her head, and said, well, in the real world, that's not really something that happens. We deal with facts. Now, we'll leave the morality and the religion to be taught at home, but in this school, we're teaching facts. And the person felt really bad and felt alienated from the group. They all were now regarded him as kind of a weirdo. And at any rate, a little bit later on, they broke. They said, now over here, we've got some name tags. Once you put the name tags on, we've got some refreshments. And we want you to kind of get to know each other better. And this guy stayed back. And the teacher said, well, you need to come on and get involved, come get a name tag. And he said, no, I'm not very welcome with this group. I'll just stay here. And the others mingled, and nobody seemed to care that he wasn't there. And they finally came back into the classroom after this break. And the teacher says, now, everybody who has a name tag, look on the back of your name tag. It's okay. One of you has a flower I have drawn on the back of this name tag. One person, oh, I've got that. Okay, that flower represents disease. You have a disease. So I want to ask you a question. Who did you make direct contact with during our break? Who did you shake hands with? Well, I shook hands with him, I shook hands with her. Okay, what about you two? Who did you shake hands with? And it ended up, they had all been touched by someone who had touched him eventually. And the teacher says, so that's the way this spreads, by contact. So all of you are infected. But one guy said, excuse me, I wasn't, because I abstained. Okay. Peter is asking us to abstain from the world. We live in the world, but let's not get into what the world is doing and wanting. He said there are sinful desires. Now, these are sinful desires of your body, but they wage war against your soul. What you do physically has an effect upon your soul. Now, this goes very much contrary to a teaching that was taking place in the latter part of the first century, which said, whatever you and I do with our bodies doesn't matter. It does not affect anything. And therefore, you can do whatever you want. You want to get involved with a prostitute, you want to take drugs, whatever, that's just your body. It's not touching your soul. And that teaching was spreading out, and John addresses that in his letter, 1 John. But Peter's addressing it here too. He's saying what you and I do with our bodies affects our soul as well. And then he gives us a word of encouragement and some advice. Live in such a way that no matter what people may say against you, they may at least see you're doing good and glorify God because of the deeds that you do that are good. Peter is elsewhere going to say, live in such a way that they're ashamed when they accuse you. So you've got your citizenship and what that means. You've got the fact that you're an alien and what that means. You're a sojourner, you're in exile. And then in verse 13, very much like the Apostle Paul will do in Romans chapter 13, he says this, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every authority instituted among men, whether to the king as the supreme authority or to governors who are sent by him to punish those who do wrong and to condemn those who do right. For it is God's will that by doing good you should silence the ignorant talk of foolish men. Live as free men, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Show proper respect to everyone. Love the brotherhood of believers. Fear God. Honor the king. You are a representative of God's people. In a sense, a representative of God himself. And that means you and I need to be subject to emperors, governors, presidents, police, subject to their authority, because Paul will point out, no authority exists except by the permission of God. The purpose for authority is what? Punish evildoers. If you don't punish evildoers, everybody starts doing evil. If children find out there are no repercussions if they don't make their bed, guess what's going to not happen in the morning? Making their bed, not going to happen. If they find out there are no repercussions if they backtalk mama or daddy, guess what happens? Start backtalking mom or dad. I don't know about you guys, but I found that real early from my mom. There are repercussions. And somebody wrote in Facebook today, you know that threat of your mama, I'm going to knock you into next year. Is that still on the table? I'm ready to be done with this year. Anyway, we are God's representatives. And he said, as God's representatives, be a good citizen. When Israel went into exile, they were told by God's prophets, seek the welfare of the city you're in. Because in so doing and seeking its welfare, you seek your own. and the Jewish people made a life for themselves in exile. They made businesses. They made friends and just created a career, so that when time came to go back, some of them hesitated to go back. Next on the list, verse 18 through 20, it talks about us being a good servant. Slaves, submit yourselves to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. For it is commendable if a man bears up under the pain of unjust suffering, because he is conscious of God. But how is it to your credit if you receive a beating for doing wrong and endure it? But if you suffer for doing good and you endure it, this is commendable before God. I think about Joseph in prison, Joseph as a slave in Potiphar's house, doing his best and being conscious of God in the process. Remember when Potiphar tried to seduce him? He said, in this house, my master has put everything under my authority. Everything that's done is done by my authority. The only thing he has kept from me is you, because you are his wife. How can I do this great sin and sin against God? Joseph was always conscious that his actions reflected on his servanthood to God. So we are told here, be a good servant. Every day when I went out to work, when I was working for a pipeline company during the summers, and I remember David Leatherwood one time said, is this just a story or something? I just have a hard time picturing you working for a pipeline company. And I said, the pipeliners had trouble envisioning a Bible major working alongside of them as well. But at any rate, I did for about 4 summers. And I remember my dad, before I went out to work, he'd tell me the same thing every morning. Make them a good hand. Make them a good hand. He didn't tell me any details. I had to figure out what made a good hand. And so it was some of the best advice I ever got. So we're supposed to be good servants, Peter tells us. In verses 21 through 25, we are to use Christ as our example. If you ever get lost, go back and look at what Christ did. To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. That is an Old Testament quotation there. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Jesus suffered so that you might be saved. You look at the life of the Apostle Paul, all the things he suffered. He said, I've become all things to all men, so that I might by every effort save some. That's following the example of Christ. Thomas, according to tradition and church history, went into India, where there are over 350 different deities, to tell them there is one God. And they killed him for it. But he went to suffer and die so they would have a chance to hear about the gospel. And this is the example of Christ that Peter puts forward to us. And he says that in the last part of verse 25, you were like sheep going astray, but now you've returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. He uses 2 terms here that refer to the office of elders here. Shepherd, which is translated once in Ephesians as pastor, and overseer, which is a word that means bishop, or has been used as bishop. But he is our shepherd and overseer of our souls. So remember this when you look for what you're supposed to do. the old phrase, what would Jesus do? The way of wording it is modern, but the idea goes back to the first century. So you're to use Christ as an example. He's going to continue this type of thinking in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. He's going to talk about you as a good wife. Not you guys, but you ladies as a good wife. Wives, in the same way, be submissive to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives. When they see the purity and reverence of your lives, your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as braided hair and the wearing of gold jewelry and fine clothes. Instead, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to make themselves beautiful. They were submissive to their own husbands, like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her master. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Submission. In the 1970s, women were polled about the traditional wedding vows. Their least favorite word in the wedding vows of that time period was the word submission or submit. Do you promise to love, honor, and submit or obey this person? And women's lib had started taking hold, and they did not like that word. But Peter says it's necessary. It's necessary for the godly woman. He turns his attention to being a good husband in verse 7. Husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives, and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. He spends less time with husbands. Some said because husbands have a shorter memory or attention span, therefore anything more would have been lost. But at any rate, there's a lot packed into this one verse. Be considerate as you live with your wife. They're to be treated with respect for two reasons. They're the weaker vessel. They are the weaker vessel. What does that mean? Weaker physically? Weaker how? I went to school with one girl that could pick up a motorcycle and move it. Not always weaker physically, but there is an aspect of the woman's nature that is weaker in the sense that men sometimes lack feelings and don't get hurt by things. And women will be hurt by those things. And it is not a good husband who takes advantage of that and uses that in that way. But they are also to be given respect because they are heirs of the gracious gift of life. They're going to heaven too. And in heaven, no giving and taking in marriage. There is that gender difference is lost in heaven. And so they are fellow heirs, just as deserving of eternal life as any man is. And he said, do this so that nothing will hinder your prayers. You cannot mistreat another person and hope that your prayers go any higher than the ceiling. If you're mistreating somebody else, God is not listening to you. Very simply put. Verses 8 through 22, and we're not going to have time to go over all of this, but at verse 8 through 22, we'll pick up on next week. But in those verses, he tells them, here's how you need to put all of this together as a church. Here's your citizenship. Recognize that not everywhere is your country. Recognize you're a representative of God's people. Be a good servant. Listen to Jesus' example. Be a good wife. Be a good husband. And then here's how the church can do it, putting it all and coming together unified. And we'll start with verse 8, Lord willing, next week. Any question before we move on or before I dismiss you?
David,
Yes.
do you think it would have anything to do with Adam and Eve? You know, Eve was made, you know, after Adam took rib, and maybe that would be looked at as a vessel. I mean, would that have anything to do with it?
Well, made second, made from his side, though. I think the difference comes with sin. Paul says it was the woman who was deceived, not the man. Adam walked into that with both eyes open, knew it was wrong, did it anyway. Eve was tricked. And he said that's an aspect of a woman in that case that makes a little bit of a difference about leadership. Paul will apply that later on. But if you notice the curse that's placed upon man, woman, the earth, the serpent, one of the curses placed on the woman is that she's going to have her pain multiplied in childbirth, yet her desire is to be to her husband who will rule over her. So as a result of sin, God placed a certain order in place that is to remain until the end of time. And recognizing that place is important. Not only, and I'm not just saying women need to know their place. Men need to know their place too. They're supposed to be leaders. They are responsible. If they're not doing what God said to do. A group of people one time asked Hugo McCord in a forum, Brother McCord, our church has some men in it, but they won't take a leading role. They won't lead prayers. They won't lead songs. And women end up leading the prayers and the songs and serving the Lord's table. And is that wrong? Should we be doing that? And Brother McCord, bless his heart, got up and says, you ladies just keep on doing that. You don't have any men in that congregation. What's a one-woman judge? Deborah. You know why she was a woman judge? Because there wasn't a man to stand up to God's enemies and follow God's instructions. And when she tells one guy, here's what God wants you to do, his answer was, I'm not going if you're not going. And remember what he's told? Oh, you'll go, but you're not going to get the credit. A woman's going to get the credit for this victory. The only time it ever happened in Israel's history that I know of, and it's because the men failed to do what men were supposed to do. Anyway, that's our time. I appreciate y'all's comments and that question.